This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to multiple-time guest Michael Holtzman, author of numerous books on espionage and the Cold War. Links to learn more about Michael and his books can be found at his authors page in the show notes. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon and Subscribestar. By joining on Patreon and or Subscribestar, you can help Beyond the Big Screen keep talking about great movies and great stories and get many great benefits for yourself. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. Another way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a good old-fashioned rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on various social media platforms by searching for A to Z History. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you again for joining me at Beyond the Big Screen. Thank you again for joining us today. I am very excited to be joined by special guest Michael Holtzman, author of the book Donald and Melinda McLean, Idealism and Espionage. Michael is the author of numerous books, including James Jesus Angleton, The CIA and Craft of Intelligence, a biography of Guy Burgess, Spies and Traitors, Kim Philby, James Angleton, and the Friendship and Betrayal that would shape MI6, as well as a novel, Pax 1934 through 41. Michael has been on the show previously to talk about James Angleton, Kim Philby, and Klaus Fuchs through his book on Spies and Traitors. So I think this will fit in very well with this. So today we're going to talk about another spy traitor story, which is related to the others we have talked about. The subject today is the dynamic duo of double-crossing Donald and Melinda McClain. Their story is more complicated, though, than that. So I'm very thankful that Michael Holtzman is here today to tell us the rest of this incredible story.
Thank you for having me on again.
Now, before we delve into the details of Donald and Melinda McClain's life, maybe you can give us a really quick overview of what their story was from the 10,000-foot view, and then we can start digging into some of the specifics.
The story is usually told as the story of the career of Donald McLean. Donald McLean was a very successful Foreign Service officer of the British Empire from 1938 or so until 1951. And then he had a second career as a think tank person specializing in political science in Moscow. During his career for the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, he was posted in many very important places: Paris, London, back in London, New York, Washington, and made it his practice to send copies of everything that came across his desk that he thought would be interesting in Moscow to Moscow. As a result of that, during that period, as one of his colleagues said, it would have been better if the British hadn't done anything. The Soviets learned all the inside details about things like the proposed intervention in the Winter War of Finland and the Soviet Union. And crucially, they learned everything there was to learn about policy issues involving the atomic bomb and the planned preemptive atomic war against the Soviet Union in the late 1940s.
What was some of his Donald McLean's background? Where did he come from, and what was his early education?
He was a member of what in the ancien regime in France was called the nobility of the robe. He wasn't quite an aristocrat. His father was a member of parliament, something of a self-made man from Scotland. His mother came from a very similar background to that of Philby's father. So that they weren't aristocrats, but they were very comfortably off and extremely well connected to the political world. Donald McLean was sent to Gresham School in Norfolk, which was considered to be a progressive school. And coincidentally, it was a school that was attended by Graham Greene, the novelist, also Benjamin Britten, the composer. He did very well there. He played sports. He was extremely active in the school newspaper and was quite well prepared for a university education. He then went to Cambridge and he lived at Trinity Hall, which is a remarkably small college, certainly by American standards. It's 2 or 3 buildings squeezed in between Trinity and King's. He majored in modern languages. He got it first. He got the highest possible score there. He made many friends. A lot of those friends were on the left, and some were on the far left, and some became communists.
Was McLean ideological in college? Did he get involved in the actual Communist Party or in these groups, or was it just a something he was interested in?
He became interested in left-wing politics while he was still at Gresham's. His best friend was a man named James Kluckman, who was came from a business background, family with a business background. And James Kluckman was very politically conscious from a very young age. McLean was politically conscious. His father, the member of parliament, who was also a member of the cabinet at one point, came to the school and gave lectures, and they were oriented towards world government at that time, peace, so forth. When he was at Cambridge, he went to the left and was probably, we have to distinguish here between being a communist and being a member of the Communist Party. He was a communist, believed in the communist ideology as soon as he stepped into Cambridge, which is fairly ironic given how privileged Cambridge was. Whether he joined the Communist Party or not, we can say he joined the Communist Party. It's not clear that the Communist Party thought he was a communist. That was a bureaucratic issue. The background of this was the socioeconomic situation in England at the time. You had a very small ruling class. I've been reading the diaries of Henry Chips Channon, who was a socialite in this period. And one can calculate that the aristocracy comprised maybe 2,000 adults, the British aristocracy. This was in a country with 50 million people. And most of the political influence, the political power in the country was through these 2,000 people. And the associated people like McLean's father. They had incomes of something like £5,000 to £10,000 a year. That would have been $45,000 in the currency of that time, and 50 times that in our currency. At the time, typical working class families had £100, and they were starving slowly.
Can you talk a little bit to the Cambridge Five? Because somebody like Donald McLean, he didn't come out of nowhere. He was in this group of like-minded individuals.
Yes. Cairncross was a Scot and wasn't really part of this. He was only associated with it in the memoirs of a Soviet official. There was a group of slightly older people in Cambridge, professors, who were kind of theoretical communists. They had seen the same situation, and they had earlier decided that made that same decision. The crucial political point, was was a general strike in the early 1920s where coal miners had their incomes cut below the subsistence level by the coal owners, and they went on strike, and the other unionized workers followed them into a strike. And the strike was defeated. It was defeated by conservative union leaders who sold out, not to put too finely a point on it, sold out the workers in return for recognition, I suppose you would say, by the government. The academic Marxists took this to be a turning point. They told their students what there was to know about these things. There was a fellow who would be equivalent to a lecturer, I guess, in our system, named Anthony Blunt. And he very early rallied to the party in a certain way. Philby was a very, very dynamic person, and as we spoke about before, and it was Philby who made contact with the Comintern, the international communist movement. He did this on a visit to Austria, to Vienna. And the Comintern person he was dealing with, Arnold Deutsch, said, "You come work with us. We're working for peace." This was mid-30s. And we're working for the betterment of the working class. Do you have any friends who would be interested in doing that? So he made a list, and the first person on his list was Donald McLean. The last person on this list was Guy Burgess. So Philby said to Deutsch, "Guy is a great fellow, but he's kind of unstable, so we won't deal with him." Deutsch said to Philby, "Okay, well, you're now with us. Tell all your friends that you've left the Communist Party and you've become a fascist." And then they brought in Donald McLean, and they said the same thing to him. He accepted. He said, "Yes, I'd like to join the Comintern system." And they said to him, "Fine, tell everybody that you've seen the light and you're going to be a bourgeois member of parliament or official of some kind as your ambition." Guy Burgess said, "You two guys are lying to me. You're up to something." And he badgered Philby until Philby introduced him to Deutsch, and he too then joined that life. Burgess is a very amusing character.
Where was Donald McLean at his career at that point when he officially joined Comintern?
He was still at Cambridge. He then graduated with this very good degree, and he signed up for the civil service exam. You'll remember that St. John Philby, Kim Philby's father, had taken that exam years before. And this was the way that the ruling group of the British Empire was recruited. McLean did very, very well. He was brought to an examining board, and they said, "We hear that you were a communist at Cambridge, leftist," I think they said. And he said, "Oh yeah, everybody goes through that phase." And since one of the people on the board was his father's very good friend, she said, "That's right, good boy." And they brought him into the Foreign Office system. They said he spent a year in France studying language. It was easy for him. And then he went to work in the Foreign Office as an entry-level person.
This really was the old boys network. It was the aristocracy. Everybody knew each other. There was no pretense that it was a civil government organization that's going to try and be open and honest. This was, everybody knew each other, and you had the right pedigree. You were going to get into this sort of job.
Yeah, it was very much an old boys system. Then there was a parallel old girls system, which ran what was called society. And what we are getting a clearer idea about these days is that those interacted. So that amongst the aristocracy, there would be lunch parties and dinner parties every day. And a couple times a week, there would be balls, dances with 500 people. I don't know about you, but my house doesn't hold 500 people who are having a dance. So that this was the scale on which these people lived. And political careers were made at the intersection of these groups. So the duchesses and so forth would say, oh, well, this person is really good, we'll make him viceroy of India, that kind of thing. It was the imperial government. Some documents, or many documents, were referred to as His Majesty's government in various places. So His Majesty's government in India, most importantly. Occasionally they'd say His Majesty's government in Great Britain. This group saw themselves as running this empire, one part of which was Great Britain. And just as the natives in India and Egypt and Iraq were troublesome from time to time, so the natives in Great Britain were seen as being troublesome from time to time. There was no sense of having any kind of connection with them.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. And it's fitting into this society. Can you tell us a little bit about Melinda McClain?
Melinda is terribly interesting. Melinda McClain was what in New York would be perfectly recognizable as an Upper East Side society. Her mother, who was also Melinda, and her daughter was also Melinda. This gets very confusing after a while. Her mother married a lot, and an early marriage was to the vice president for public relations for an oil company, and his name was Francis Dunbar. And after a while, they had two daughters, I think, Melinda and Harriet. There was a divorce, and Mrs. Dunbar went to France and put the girls into a private finishing school for rich girls, and where they learned French. And then went back to New York and married another executive. This fellow was the executive of a paper company in New York. He had a house on Park Avenue, an apartment on Park Avenue, and an estate in the Berkshires, and that's the kind of people they were. Melinda went to the Spence School, which for some reason would never give me her transcripts. I asked them very politely. And she did okay. She got bored, and when she graduated from the Spence School, high school, she started going out to parties in New York City. We're talking about 1936, 37, something like that. So these were nightclubs in Harlem, and sort of thing. I think she had a Jewish boyfriend, which wasn't pleasing to her mother, and couldn't quite figure out what to do. Mrs. Dunbar, her mother, obviously thought that the thing that she should do is get married to a rich man. She said, I want to go back to Paris. So late 30s, she went to Paris. She said, I'm going to study at the Sorbonne. It's said that she might have studied. Mostly she sat around in cafes. She lived in an apartment house, which was next door to the principal cafe on the left bank where all the bohemians were, where Sartre and de Beauvoir and so on. She made quite a hit, got around. And that's where she met Donald McLean. And in one of the more unusual proposals, I thought, he said, I want to marry you. And she said, you're too dull. You're just a British diplomat. Why would I want to marry you? He said, I'm a spy. And she said, oh, well, that's more interesting. So she knew from before the time they were married that he was working with the Comintern.
Would somebody like Donald McLean normally have been in her class, you might say?
Not normally, and she didn't. She was very close to her mother and remained so all her mother's life, which was very long. The difference between the American ruling class and the British ruling class It looks like it was very small to us, but at the time it was very significant. And I guess Mrs. Dunbar was what we would recognize as a society person at the top of the tree. But the British said, "We don't know your ancestors. Who are you? Anyway, you dress funny." Dressing funny means she bought her clothes in Paris. So there was an ongoing kind of irritation that way. Melinda was very quiet, and nobody knew what she was thinking. So she appeared to be, from as soon as she got married to Donald McLean, as the perfect Foreign Office wife.
Maybe lay out a little bit of McLean's early career, Donald McLean's early career in the Foreign Office, and what were some of the things that he was doing to help the Soviets in this early part of his career.
Okay, so he was in Paris as World War was coming on, and there were a series of complicated diplomatic moves. As you know, there was the Munich events. And just before the Munich conference, it was unclear what the sides were going to be. As the Czechs were being threatened by the Germans, Stalin said, "Look, I'll help you. I'll send our Air Force to Prague, and I'll send the Red Army." And the British and French said, no, we don't want the Red Army in Czechoslovakia. People said that for a long time after. And we would prefer, in effect, the end of Czechoslovakia to having the country rescued by the communists, by the Soviet Union. These maneuvers were going on, of course, in secret, and there were kind of odd things that would happen, and unclear who was responsible for it. It was the British and the French were responsible for these things. Their work together, the British and French governmental work together, which was to prevent the Soviet Union from assisting Czechoslovakia, was highly secret. All the documents concerning that went across the desk of the British ambassador in Paris, and Donald McLean made copies of them and sent them to the Soviet Union, so they were able to do that. A very dramatic event that occurred while he was in Paris was that the Soviet Union declared war on Finland. After some months, the Finns fought back and they did very well, but then they eventually started to collapse. And the British and French decided that they didn't want the Finns to collapse. And so they got together an expeditionary force. This was in 1939, and that was going to go up to northern Norway and across the Arctic Circle to Finland to reinforce them, to keep the Soviet Union from winning the war. It also coincidentally meant that they would be able to seize the iron ore mines up there, which was the principal source of iron ore for Germany. Something like a week before the Franco-British expeditionary force was about to sail, Stalin said, "This war has gone on long enough, I'm stopping." And much to the chagrin of London and Paris. And the reason that he was able to do this was probably largely because Donald McLean was sending him all the negotiation done. So that was those were his primary accomplishments for Stalin in Paris. When the Germans came down at the beginning in 1940 and occupied Paris, it was as they were approaching the city, this was the time when Donald McLean said to Melinda, "I think you should get married." And they got married as the German army was coming through the Paris suburbs. They were then evacuated to Britain. In Britain, he was assigned to economic affairs in the Foreign Office and was able to provide the Soviet Union with information about how economic warfare was being done and about various supplies. The one that is usually mentioned was something called wolfram, which is tungsten, which was absolutely essential to harden the steel that was used in tanks. So they were to do that. McLean did a good job. He always did a good job for the British Foreign Office. And at that point, he was sent to Washington.
Was Donald McLean working independently, or did he have other contacts inside of the British government that he was coordinating with?
You mean for the Soviet Union?
For the Soviet Union. Was there other Soviet agents who he collaborated with, or was he really doing his own independent activities?
As far as I know, the only person he was in contact with was Guy Burgess. Guy Burgess was kind of a collector of information. So he had his own contacts, and then he took material from McLean and transmitted this to the Soviet Union. I think that it's important to make something clear here. In the spy world, in popular culture, this person's a spy, that person's a spy. I think if one wants to keep clean about this, there are intelligence officials, people who are civil servants working for government, American government, British government, Soviet government. They have pensions. I think this is the important point. They have pensions. That's how you can tell them. Then there are agents. And the CIA refers to these as contract agents. And they have contracts. We're employing you to go assassinate Patrice Lumumba, and we'll pay you to do this for 6 months, and we'll give you a rifle. And who's your next of kin? We'll get the next of kin some money if you're killed while you're doing that. And then there are sources. A source is what anybody who is either a contract agent or an intelligence official says is a source. John Kennedy was a source listed by the KGB people in Washington at that time. John Kennedy didn't think he was a spy. It's just a matter of how the Soviet officials referred to him. Somewhere in the murkiness there are volunteer sources who were conscious that that's what they were doing. And the Cambridge people, Cambridge spies, were conscious sources. They were not agents. I carelessly referred to Philby as a double agent. Philby wasn't a double agent. Philby was a official, civil service official of the British government, and he was a source for the Soviets. I'm sorry about going on like that, but people get very tangled up in these things. So McLean was working by himself, except for the fact that he was transmitting information sometimes to Guy Burgess.
And somebody like Philby, he really was just doing it out of the goodness of his heart. To basically, he wasn't getting remunerated, or there was no quid pro quo for what he was doing.
Right. He was doing it out of the evil of his heart. Yeah, he wasn't being paid. None of them were being paid.
And so, having read all of these documents, the motivation for somebody like Donald McLean is he really thought he was promoting peace and the class struggle and ideology.
Yes, he thought he was working for peace, and as particularly after the end of the Second World War, he was aware of the planning by the British and American governments to have a preemptive war against the Soviet Union. And he was trying to stop that.
Can you tell us a little bit about Donald McLean's time in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, he was sent there as the Foreign Office has the ambassador, a minister, a counselor, a first, second, and third secretary. So in Paris, McLean was a third secretary. The bottom, clean up that mess over there, please. When he was sent to Washington, he was second secretary. He was very charming and worked harder than anybody else, and was athletic. And he played tennis with the ambassador, Lord Halifax, in the afternoons, and got more and more responsibility that wasn't, in some cases, wasn't strictly what you would expect of a second secretary, or then he became a first secretary. The negotiations were, he saw everything about the alliance between the United States and Great Britain. And there was points like, is there going to be a second front? And then would the nuclear technology be shared with the Soviet Union? Both the United States and Great Britain had treaties with the Soviet Union. They were allies. There was the Anglo-Soviet Treaty in 1942 that was signed by Winston Churchill, and they said they would share everything, and they didn't. And so people, McLean and Philby, filled in that gap. It's difficult to list everything that McLean saw and sent over. He sent over everything. He also, at the time, he and Melinda were in the Georgetown set, the journalist, CIA, FBI, diplomatic group that had parties together. Phil Graham, the Washington Post, and Catherine of the Washington Post were kind of at the center of that. Angleton was in it. Isaiah Berlin was in it. The British diplomats were all in it, and they all played tennis together, and they had dinner parties, and they got drunk, and they told each other their secrets. So at the end of the war, McLean was still in Washington, and the United States and Great Britain formed the Combined Policy Committee, which made decisions about the atomic bomb, about its secrets. So they were trying to monopolize all uranium in the world, which was interesting. And last time I went to London, I was able to see some files about these terribly mundane-looking files where we think that there's a good source over here and we can buy it for this amount of money and so on. What they were doing was they were buying uranium worldwide, thinking that, and if they monopolize the sources of uranium, something called thorium, no one else would be able to have a bomb. And McLean was tracking. There was also emerging friction between the United States and Great Britain about the possession of the bomb. There had been an agreement, a Hyde Park agreement between Churchill and Roosevelt that said that it was a joint venture, that the development of the bomb was a joint venture and everything about it would be shared. When Roosevelt died, the emerging group said that they didn't want to share anything with Great Britain. And that was something that McLean could track. Towards the end of the time he was there was the kind of run up to the Korean War and policies about that, and whether the atomic bomb would be used in the Korean War. And he was able to transmit that.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. McLean was giving the Soviets documents by the truckload and information. Was there at any point counterintelligence people saying, this guy doesn't look right to us?
Oh, no, but I thought he looked really right. He seemed to be the very model of a diplomat. What happened was like a time machine. And I think we spoke about this with both Philby and Klaus Fuchs, was that during the Battle of Moscow in 1941-42, when the Nazis got within trolley car distance of the Kremlin, there was a panic in the Soviet intelligence services, and everything was falling apart, and their encoding procedures fell apart. They were encoding their messages with something called one-time pads, which I won't discuss. It's too complicated. But in any case, they reused them. So they weren't one-time pads. They were two-time pads. And the American intelligence, both the American and British intelligence service, depends on who you get the story from. The Americans said they did it, and the British said they did it. Were recording the radio transmissions of these codes, which seemed at the time to be useless. They were, 45798 kind of thing. but they kept them. And there were some brilliant cryptographers, and there were the early computers the Brits had that were able to break into some parts of some of these messages. And they found out that the Soviets had a source in the British embassy, and they couldn't find out who it was, but they got various circumstantial evidence about it. And they had a list of 6-8 people, and they were going through this list. And every time McLean's name came up, Philby, who was the British intelligence liaison in Washington at the time, would say, "Oh no, not him." So you go back down to the bottom of the list. But eventually they discovered that this person had been taking frequent trips to New York City from Washington. And Melinda McClain, as I said much earlier here, was very close to her mother and was spending a lot of time in New York with her and was pregnant. And so the Soviets had decided that it would be safer to have the person to whom McLean delivered information be in New York rather than in Washington. So that's what he was doing. They were able to trace these things, and they thought, okay, that's the guy who's transmitting the information. The problem for counterintelligence people with a spy at McLean's level is that you have to get them to confess, because you can't go into court and say, this person has been giving information to the Soviets that he's not authorized to do. And we have the proof, which is these decryptions, which were more secret than the atomic bomb. So they couldn't bring them into courts. They had to get it into court. So they were just watching him. None of the another issue here is that they weren't traitors, you know. The traitor is someone who in wartime does things against the welfare of their country. It wasn't wartime with the Soviet Union, and so they couldn't be accused of treason. This was also the case with Kosovo, because he thought he was going to be hung for treason, but they couldn't accuse him of treason. So they were accused of violating the Official Secrets Acts. McLean was then, at the end of his tour of duty, was promoted again. And he was promoted to be counselor of the embassy in Cairo, which doesn't sound like much now, but Cairo had been the center of the British Empire's war ever. All the supply things and everything. It was next to London was the most important city at this time in the British Empire. And so to be the number 3 person in that place was absolutely crucial. He would have seen everything that had to do with imperial defense, let's say, and diplomatic moves. And at this point, it gets very colorful. I think there should be a movie about this. So we're in Cairo. King Farouk is still in nominal charge. The British are running things behind the scenes. There's this incredible density of aristocrats, Egyptian aristocrats, Turkish aristocrats, British aristocrats, spies from everywhere. It was like a kind of Casablanca on supercharge. In the documents that I was able to see, you could see the documents that came across McLean's desk, and what they were was increasingly the planning for the preemptive war by Britain and the United States against the Soviet Union. They were going to have hundreds of atomic bombs. These were the primitive 1940s atomic bombs, so they'd only destroy 20,000 people. They were going to have these concentrated on the oil fields in Baku, down near the Caspian Sea, and then the major populations. Melinda, at this point, had become a very successful person in Cairo society. She was very popular, and they did a lot of entertaining. They lived in a mansion on an island in the Nile, where central to the embassy's operations. The ambassador was pretty ineffective. And so more and more responsibility was put on McLean to actually run things. Something happened. He either had a nervous breakdown from all that pressure, as well as the pressure of being a source, or he had an alcoholic breakdown. All these people are alcoholics. Everybody in the British government and aristocracy and all the spies, they're all alcoholics. McLean got seriously alcoholic, so was interfering with his life. It was then you just get rumors. You have rumors that he was having sex with men in the bazaar, or that he was having an affair with one of the Egyptian princesses. Melinda was having an affair with a Egyptian aristocrat who was running their version of the Red Cross, the Green Crescent. I hesitated there because the politics of Egypt is very complicated. The Egyptian royal family was Turkish because it had been part of the Ottoman Empire. So you had these aristocrats who you would say were Egyptian aristocrats, but they're actually Ottoman aristocrats. Anyway, this fellow was an Ottoman aristocrat whose family lived in Egypt, and Melinda was having an affair with him. She decided, it is said, that Donald McLean had to get out of Cairo. And he had a drunken event where he trashed the apartment of a secretary in the American embassy just to make sure that everyone knew. And he was withdrawn from Cairo and sent back to Washington, back to London. We'll make you head of the American desk, which was the highest level somebody of his rank had. Absolutely crucial. 1950, the British-American alliance, the Korean War coming on. McLean was there. And so he was sending, I thought he would just overwhelmed the Soviets with the amount of information he was able to send from them. After a little less than a year, Philby realized that the game was on, that the Venona decrypts had absolutely focused on Donald McLean and that they were going to get him. They thought, Philby thought, the Soviet intelligence people thought that McLean was worn out, that he was a burnt out case, and that if the British special branch interrogated him, he would tell them everything, and that would be terribly damaging to the Soviet intelligence effort. So they wanted him to leave, to go to Moscow. Guy Burgess, who was in Washington at the time, devised a typical Guy Burgess plan to get to London to give McLean the word, which was he went on a drunken automobile trip through Virginia, had himself arrested for speeding 3 times, kissed a patrol officer, and so forth. And they said, the American government said, you can't remain in Washington. And Burgess said, oh, that's great. And they shipped him to London. He got to London. He made contact with the Soviet people who were watching the situation. He went to various pubs with McLean and said, yeah, you're leaving, Guy. And worked out a way to get McLean to France. But from France, they went to Prague, and Burgess thought that he was just going to go home again. But the Soviets said, no, you're going to. And both of them went to Moscow, just vanished as far as the West was concerned. And it took a couple of years before it was discovered that they had not fallen off the ship, that they had gone to Moscow.
What was Donald McLean's second life, you might call it, in Moscow like?
It was better than his first life from his point of view. He gets to Moscow, they send him off to Samara, out in the country, and cure him of his alcoholism in the Soviet way, which is they locked him in a room with nothing to drink, no alcohol to drink until he was over it, or at least the worst of it. He spent some time, then there's this completely bizarre thing where Melinda, who is left in London, says, it's awful. I don't know what happened to my husband, but he's left me. I'm very, very upset. And the British secret intelligence people, the police said, "Oh, poor dear. Well, what do you want? We'll take care of you." They did. After some months, she said, "Well, I think I'll go back to Switzerland where I went to school, and I'll take my children with me." She had 3 children at that time. And they say, "Okay, we'll help you get to Switzerland, and we'll support you there." And she went to Switzerland, and one day she disappeared with her children, and she reappeared in Moscow. And the Soviet intelligence people, easier for me just to say the KGB, gave them an apartment in a good neighborhood, or at that time. Donald McLean learned Russian and became fluent in Russian. He spent some years becoming fluent in Russian at this time. And the McLeans were part of the nomenclatura, the ruling group, strata, in the Soviet Union. So they would go to the opera, go to Bolshoi, take trips up to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and to go to the museums and so forth. Donald McLean started doing some journalism, kind of journalism, political journalism. And then after a few years, he joined a think tank specializing in political science policy. He became kind of like a professor, and he had proteges, and he was very, very well regarded. Home life was not so good. Melinda, when they went to, the McLeans went to Moscow in the early 1950s, and mid-1960s, as you'll recall, Philby shows up. And Philby, very charming man, and Donald McLean was busy. Melinda and Kim Philby got busy, and that went on for about a year. And then that broke up, and Melinda rented an apartment with a view of the Kremlin on her own. So you had Donald McLean had the family apartment, and Melinda had this other. Melinda then decided, and this is very mysterious, and it isn't in my book because I've got this stuff later. She decided she wanted to go home to her mother. So one day she walks into the American embassy in Moscow, and she says, "I'm Melinda McClain, and my passport's expired. I'd like a new passport because I want to go visit my mother in New York." And the consul, the low guy who dealt with things like that, said, "Oh, sure. Fill out this form." And I have the form saying what you've been doing, and I'll put it through the process. So I've talked to some people about this, and what the official records are, she filled out the form and said, "I'm just a housewife, you know." And they said, "Okay." And so she got on a plane and she went to New York. I think what really happened was that as soon as she left the embassy, everybody went running around frantically, and they contacted whoever was Secretary of State at the time, Schultz. So what are we going to do about this? And he said, "Well, if she wants to defect, that's great, you know, so let her go." So she got to New York, and all this time, her mother, Dunbar, had been working with the FBI. First, when Melinda initially disappeared, and then as Melinda and her children, Dunbar's grandchildren, were living in Moscow, Mrs. Dunbar was working with the FBI to find them and then to facilitate her visit to Moscow so she could see them, and so forth. And the relationship between Mrs. Dunbar and the FBI is quite amusing. She thought they worked for her. It would be as if, you know, a rich woman on the Upper East Side in New York in the corner cop. That's how she dealt with it. So they were familiar. She had a house on Cape Cod too. So the FBI would visit her and visit Mrs. Dunbar in New York to keep track of what was going on. "Have you got any letters from Moscow recently?" And visit in on Cape Cod. Melinda McClain went to New York, went to Cape Cod, had some kind of relationship with the FBI that was developing. it looked like she and her mother had a kind of pet FBI agent who was helping them. Then she went back to Moscow after her visa had expired. We're talking about the 70s here. And so things were loosening up and there's a lot of communication. Eventually, she just immigrated, if that's what you call it, to the United States and lived happily ever after.
When did she die?
She died in 2013.
Oh, wow. So she lived quite a while after Donald McClain died in the early 80s. Donald McLean led this think tank, and he was more of a liberal, you might say, in the Soviet system. How did he affect events that would later unfold, especially towards the end of the Soviet Union, which he didn't get to quite see?
Yeah, he would have been in the groups of which Gorbachev was a member. I don't think he had a relation with Gorbachev, but as I said, he had a relationship with the person who was prime minister at the time. So what you had is something that's called late Soviet communism. That they were loosening up. They were gradually transitioning to a system that was more open, less repressive. The Gulag was being closed down. And he was part of the intelligentsia that was working on that. Probably in terms of intellectual influence. I don't think he did anything in terms of operations. I have a friend who is a British journalist, and he was talking about being in Russia just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the people where nothing was working, under Yeltsin. And he said the people that he talked to, the common people that he talked to, kept saying, well, things were a lot better under Brezhnev before Gorbachev, where the Soviet system was beginning to work. They were beginning to figure out how to make it work. And that was the world in which Donald McLean lived.
What should we take away from Donald McLean's really fascinating career? He's it's not quite an agent, but a spy. He's giving the Soviets tons of information. Then he has this entire fascinating second life in the Soviet Union. The casual observer and the person who's interested in the Cold War, how should we evaluate Donald McLean?
Well, I think the first part of his life was a tragedy. He was kind of torn apart by that. On the one hand, he was the son of his father. He was working through the Foreign Office. He almost certainly would have become an ambassador on his next assignment. And that would have made he would have been knighted then as a 13. So he would have been, as his father was, knighted. And then he was doing this other stuff. He was very, very unhappy. And then when he went to the Soviet Union, after a while, he had a fulfilling career. There's an interesting parallel to this. His second in command, when he was his deputy, when he was head of the American desk, was a man named Robert Cecil, who was one of the Cecils, part of aristocracy. When Don McLean disappeared, the British system cranked up. He said everyone associated with him is dead. It's not the United States, so they weren't really dead. Their careers were blocked, including his younger brother, who's also somewhat interesting. So Robert Cecil went from being a rising star in the Foreign Office, assisted by the fact that he was an aristocrat, to become a professor. So he was a professor at the University of Reading, I think, and wrote articles on political science and wrote books on political science. He had exactly the same career from that point as Donald McLean. I think that how we should look at it depends on how we look at the Cold War. I've just finished writing a book called The Anglo-American Cold War, which was about how the United States worked to destroy the British Empire in the 1940s. And how Franklin Roosevelt in particular did this. The American-Soviet Cold War began in the breakdown of Roosevelt's foreign policy. So you can look at it the way it was looked at by American media at the time, that you had this horrible dictatorship that was expansionist and was going to take over the whole world. And it had to be stopped, and the only force that could stop it was the United States. Or you could look at it from the Soviet point of view, which was that you had this country that had been completely devastated in the Second World War, and the leadership knew from Donald McLean and others that the United States was planning a war against it. And when that was abandoned because flukes had given them the information for the atomic bomb, what you had was covert action, the attempt to roll back Soviet power. And the Cold War was a continuing effort by the part of the Soviet Union to not be conquered.